About the time our speaker joined the staff of the Ford Foundation, the foundation offered a challenge locally here to the Oregon Symphony Orchestra, along with several other major performing arts organizations around the country. And they told the symphony, if you folks out here can raise $1 million, we'll match it. It took almost 3 years in those days for the Oregon Symphony to make that match, but it was made. The match was successful. The Ford Foundation matched it. The board of directors of the symphony at that time took a deep breath and tied those funds up in a trust that has been a remarkable success. The trust paid out only a portion of the income, and the remainder of the income over the years has been reinvested. The value today of that endowment fund is $7.3 million. It's one of the major endowments of any major orchestra in the nation. If the fund continues to be as successful in the next 10 years as it has been in the past, that endowment will be in the neighborhood of $15 million within 10 years. And of course, as the market value of the endowment continues to 15, 15. Frank, you could help it become 50 if you'd like.
My guardian is not sure.
The reason that many of us are particularly proud of this is that many of these challenge grants that were made in that period, through crises and problems and so on that performing arts organizations have had over the years, have disappeared. This one has not. This one survived the most serious crisis the symphony's had in its history over the last year that I know many of you are familiar with. It's intact, it's healthy, and it continues to do an incredible job and shows what innovative work of a foundation like the Ford Foundation can mean to a community like ours. Susan Berresford was born in New York City. She attended Vassar College, studied American history at Radcliffe, where she graduated cum laude in 1965. After graduating, she served as a program officer with the New York Neighborhood Youth Corps, as an evaluator of training and education and work programs for the New York Manpower Career Development Agency, and since 1970 has been with the Ford Foundation as a project assistant in the Division of National Affairs, as a program officer in the Division of National Affairs, where she developed and managed and evaluated grants programs for the enhancement of rights and opportunities of women, and since 1981 as Vice President for all United States and International Affairs Program grants. She currently manages grants and programs with the biennial budget in excess of $250 million. She's a real pro in this foundation business, no question. Her areas of interest and responsibility cut across 6 program areas that define the organization of the foundation: urban poverty, rural poverty and resources, human rights and social justice, governance and public policy, education and culture, and international affairs. She's responsible for the foundation program-related investments, loans, and loan guarantees of equity investments made from a $100 million set-aside of the foundation portfolio. These actions support activities consistent with of course, the Ford Foundation program interests. She also serves as a member of the Board of Directors of the Council on Foundations. It's my real pleasure to present Susan Berresford.
Thank you very much. I am very pleased to be in Portland today. I've always admired this state's scenic beauty, my grant-making colleagues here, and a number of your very progressive public policies. I've also been aware of the fact that some of our most creative grant strategies have found a way into the grant-making world here in Portland. So I am pleased to be here, but I'm also struck by the fact that there are probably few states in this country which are farther from the home base of the Ford Foundation in New York, and that despite the fact we've made probably $8 million of grants here in the last 2 or 3 decades, that a lot of you are unfamiliar with the foundation. Foundations are very often mysterious creatures to people outside them. So I thought I would just begin today with a few facts about the Ford Foundation to give you some sense of the institution I work for. We have both an international and a domestic program which has always addressed 3 broad concerns. The first is the reduction of poverty and injustice around the world. The second is the reduction of tensions that threaten world peace and stability. And the third is the strengthening of scholarly, analytic, and artistic resources in countries around the world. There is no shortage of ideas coming to us on how to do that. Depending on what day of the week it is, we receive between 4,000 and 2,000 pieces of mail a day, 4,000 on Mondays and down to 2,000 by Fridays. Our staff travel all around the country, probably a third to a half of their time on the road, talking to people, learning from local experiences, and hundreds of people visit the foundation every week. Our grants and loans come from a portfolio that totals $5.2 billion, and we spend now about $300 million per year. 2/3 of our grants and loans are in the United States, and 1/3 overseas, principally in developing countries. And our work in developing countries operates out of 9 field offices, 3 in Latin America, 3 in Asia, and 3 in Africa. We have about 150 grant-making staff of one kind or another, and we make about 1,800 grants per year. It's interesting to think about the difference between the 4,000 pieces of mail a day, many hundreds of which are proposals, and the 1,800 grants we make per year. I thought I'd try and illustrate a few of the ways a foundation, a national foundation like Ford operates, by talking briefly today about 2 subjects, poverty and immigration. Let me begin with poverty. Ford's work to reduce poverty accounts for approximately 60% of our work in the United States, and it includes a huge range of projects, including interesting approaches to urban and rural revitalization, economic growth, school improvement, fellowship programs, work on teenage pregnancy, a teenage fathers program that grew out of Portland here. There's much, much more, but I thought I would best describe what we do by selecting just one aspect of our poverty work, and that is the creation of a new kind of organization that the foundation helped create and that we believe now is playing a crucial role in the development of knowledge that we need in order to frame social policy on poverty in this country. Foundations very often support organizations, and occasionally they create them. And I think part of understanding the Ford Foundation is understanding how and why we create something. One effort of this kind began a couple of years ago when we were reflecting on a number of years of experience with anti-poverty work, and we were struck by 3 facts. One, that in many cases, a good idea that had worked on a small scale was quickly touted around the country as the model, and it was promoted in community after community and then had rather disappointing results. Second, we noted that when new experiments were launched in one or a few places, the programs often had to go out and raise substantial sums of money from a variety of funding sources, and that effort itself was enormously taxing and often distracted the program operators' attention from the quality of their own program, and hence, again, some sense of failure and discouragement. And finally, we noted that in very many cases, anti-poverty programs that had been launched around the country had not been carefully researched and therefore were not well understood, and their results not known. So we decided to try and create a new kind of organization that combined several functions. It assembled substantial sums of money at the beginning. It then selected talented local programs in a number of locations and contracted with them to run experimental anti-poverty efforts. And it studied the results very carefully, comparing the effects of those who participated with another similar group who had not participated. This use of very rigorous social science research methodology applied to programs operating at significant levels of scale, and the determination to publicize the results of these efforts, unencumbered by political influence, was a novel combination in the early 70s when we began this. One such organization we created is called today the Manpower Demonstration Research Corporation. You may know it as MDRC, its more popular title. In the early 70s, it tested a concept called supported work. That concept taught that if very difficult to employ people were given very carefully structured work experience with a lot of supervision, and then slowly increasing levels of scale until normal work was approximated, many would make the transition from work to welfare. From welfare to work, sorry. 4 groups were tested in this experiment in 15 sites all over the country. And the 4 groups were former drug addicts, unemployed youth, ex-offenders, and welfare mothers. It was interesting that the welfare mothers were added to the experiment towards the end of its planning, and there was great fear on the part of the experimental program designers that the welfare mothers would be the biggest failure because with their daycare problems they would be very unlikely to achieve the employment results that were desired. Well, the results surprised everybody. Only one group succeeded, and you can probably guess which it was. It was the welfare mothers. The findings of this research and the great success the welfare mothers had in transitioning and in holding on to good jobs and in the increase in earnings that came from this helped build the consensus, or begin the consensus, on which the welfare reform effort is riding today. I'd like to underscore one point about this part of the story. It's interesting to stop and ask yourself whether, if that experiment had been conducted by a public agency and found 3 out of its 4 experimental groups failing and only 1 succeeding, whether anybody would have ever learned about the results. My experience working in federal agencies and working in city government is that that's a very risky business to get up and say that 3 of the groups failed, and that one of the roles of these independent organizations is to tell the truth and speak candidly about this. The same organization, MDRC, has continued to study welfare and has very recently been in the last stages of a study of 11 states' experiences with workfare. Each of the 11 states wanted to test some combination of required work, job search, and training for welfare recipients. In 8 of the 11 states, the same organization, MDRC, constructed experimental and control groups and measured the results carefully. And again, the results surprised the policymakers, and these reports are just coming out now. They found that the work requirements of workfare were not regarded negatively, as many had predicted they would be, but that while work requirements were acceptable, they only brought marginal changes. Reductions in welfare costs were small, and so were increases in earnings. And so the real message that's coming out from these reports is that it is fair and probably practical to expect work from able-bodied people. But it's also fair to recognize that some workers will need long-term income support if they're going to live at an even minimally adequate level. Fairness then requires the redefinition of workfare to mean that work and welfare can go together. Again, I think it's important to underscore the role that MDRC has been able to play in this debate. If you look back at the history of social policy development of the last 20 years, I think you see a lot of overpromising. And overpromising causes disappointment and disillusionment gets translated in the public mind into nothing works. We've heard a lot of that over the last years. One of the key roles of the organizations that we've helped create, such as MDRC, is to be clear about what doesn't work, but be equally clear about what does work, and have social science carefully assembled evidence on which to defend these points. And I think that will help contribute to the development of a sounder and fairer social policy. Another Ford-created social science research intermediary is called Public-Private Ventures. Some of you may know that. It's done some work here in Portland. This intermediary is concentrated on problems of youth employment and youth in poverty. For the last 2 years, it's been conducting a fascinating set of experiments testing whether the summer months can be used effectively to prevent high school dropout. The experiment grew out of some very interesting work reviewing the summer loss of grade level among 3,000 Atlanta school children and 200,000 participants in a special education program around the country. These more than 20,000 students were studied over 2 years in the intervening summer. And the researcher found that first, advantaged and disadvantaged kids learned at about the same rate. but that the gains made by the disadvantaged kids decayed during the summer, while the advantaged kids held their own. In other words, 2 steps ahead and 1 back was the norm for the disadvantaged students. And since discouragement and falling behind in grade level seems to be a very key contributor to the dropout problem, it seemed important to see if we could stem this loss and thereby reduce the dropout rate. And so for the last 2 years, this intermediary organization has run a very carefully measured 5-site experimental program. The experiment has 1 site in Oregon. It uses regular summer federal jobs program monies and gives kids a half-day work experience and half-day very high-quality education and life planning studies during the summer. At the end of the 2nd summer, that was 1986, the experiment showed some very exciting results. Control group youth who did not get the special education program lost 1/3 to 1/2 of the grade gain they had made in the prior school year. Experimental students lost much less, and in the case of math, actually gained. The researchers also noted some very promising changes in reported sexual behavior among the students, and they believe that may lead to lower pregnancy rates in the coming months. Also interesting was the fact that in some of the sites, Hispanic students showed some of the most striking results, and this was contrary to the usual story where Hispanic kids have the greatest difficulty in school. Public-Private Ventures, the intermediary, is conducting this experiment through this summer, and if the results continue to hold up, I believe it will make us rethink the length of the school year, what we offer students during the summer month, and how we use the vast federal funds that are spent on youth employment between June and September. Portland will be part of that story. But again, let me draw the distinction between a program in Portland and the kind of program this is that attracted a national foundation. The results, however successful they will be in Portland, will not be as convincing to public policy analysts around the country as will be the results from 5 different sites, one would hope even more than 5 ultimately. And that is what attracted the Ford Foundation to put money into this project and ultimately put money into Portland. The directors of the Ford Foundation are very pleased with the results that come out of these intermediary organizations. But we now believe that they assume a very special significance when you consider the changing national context in which the organizations were first created and now operate. They were first created at a time when the federal government was very actively involved in program experimentation to address poverty, and the real audience for their work was an activist federal administration. The original idea was that strategies could be proved effective and they would automatically be replicated. That proved to be a naive assumption. When a less activist administration moved into the White House, federal interest in program experimentation dimmed, and funding for social programs declined. The new intermediaries had to completely reorient their tactics for program design and replication and for fundraising. But the changing federal landscape also meant that the role played by these intermediaries became increasingly crucial. In many instances, organizations like MDRC in welfare or PPV in youth employment would be the principal voice in the nation which constructed and carefully analyzed extensive national experiments and conveyed to the public and policymakers the results based on verified nonpartisan research. In other words, these groups had the opportunity to become the principal source of experimental learning in the poverty fields they had covered, and that's exactly what's happened. Thus, when MDRC announced the results of its 11-state workfare experiment, it was national news. It was reported on op-ed pages around the country, on major TV and editorial pages around the country. They were invited to the White House to brief the White House staff, and have been invited to a number of state capitals to brief the governors and their staffs. I believe if PPV continues its experiment on the summer loss of learning, it will contain very dramatic results, and it too will be the authoritative national voice on this subject. I think that support of these relatively new players in the social policy scene is crucial, and that the Ford Foundation and others who have supported them at the national level are making a terribly important contribution to the development of knowledge, and knowledge is terribly important in the formation of social policy. The success of these groups, however, led us to note one of their limitations. They were not very effective, it turned out, in stimulating the replication, the widespread replication of effective strategies. Somehow the energy and the mindset that was needed to take an effective idea from a moderate level of scale and then measure it, and then move it to a truly national reach wasn't present. And the more we came to think about it, the more we were convinced that large-scale replication of social experiments and effective strategies presented very different challenges. And so that led us to create a whole other group of intermediary organizations designed to stimulate this replication process. And I'll just mention 3 that we have created. The first is called the Local Initiative Support Corporation, and it was designed to multiply the number and scale of community development corporations operating in inner-city slum communities. It now has funding of $150 million, mostly from corporations, and has developed community development corporations in dozens of U.S. cities. The second was the Remediation and Training Institute, which decided to take a very effective basic education and skills program and move it into hundreds of communities around the country. And it has done this using a franchise approach in a very creative and interesting way. The third was the Public Education Fund, and that was responsible for taking a very successful model of a small grants program for innovative teachers in public schools and moving it to 100 communities. And what we tried to do there was a new kind of replication design and say you have 5 years to do this and 5 years only, and at the end we're closing the whole thing down. And they believe, having now completed the 5 years, that that particular message enabled them to be much more venturesome, much more entrepreneurial and risk-taking than they would have been if they'd been worrying about the future of the organization over the long term. So we're in the middle now of thinking a lot about these replication strategies, trying to learn from them, trying to think about what we'll do with them in the future. And we believe that it's another important role for a national foundation, because local foundations often develop good ideas. We can help test them to scale, but then we still need to figure out how you move them to some kind of national reach. Let me now switch to another subject, to immigration. I chose this because it's a way to talk about a very different role the foundation plays, one that is much more closely tied to life in neighborhoods and to the activities of local donors. From the start of our work in the immigration field, the Foundation's program reflected a belief that large-scale movement of people was a natural response to fear, to opportunity, to unsettled and unpromising conditions, and that a full program addressing these concerns needed to include such measures as, first, a resettlement assistance program, second, an effort of development in the sending countries to improve livelihoods so the need to move would be diminished. Third, the promotion and development of human rights principles and protections that would reduce persecution and community tension that often led to flight. And finally, it was critical to have a mechanism ready to respond to natural disasters, which also caused flight. And happily, as a domestic and international foundation, we've been able to work on all of these fronts. As the U.S. program evolved in recent years, it has averaged about $5 million per year and is centered on 4 strategies: research on the causes and consequences of immigration to the U.S., education of a broad public about these matters, efforts to clarify and monitor laws relating to migrants and refugees, and finally, measures to assist newcomer groups to get on their feet economically. From the start of our program, we have always relied very heavily on the information and work and ideas of local and regional donors. They help us shape our ideas, they help steer us to effective grant recipients, and they're a wonderful channel of information for us. We recently heard from cities such as El Paso, Los Angeles, Miami, Chicago, and other areas around the country that they were terribly concerned about the problems raised by the new immigration law, that the new amnesty provisions and the employer sanctions provisions were not well understood, that the local agencies were having a great deal of trouble gearing up to make the new law work, and they asked us to come in and try and put together a program. So very recently, in response to those requests from local donors and activists, we've launched about $2.5 million of grants which respond to these very special circumstances of the new law. And I thought I'd just illustrate a couple of examples of the kinds of things we're doing there. In the first category, research, We're discussing how we might add to some of the national longitudinal samples that are studied by research groups around the country, samples of recently documented and also undocumented newcomers to this country so that their life histories could be traced along with those of other longer-term residents. We also just launched a process by which 6 communities will be chosen to be studied very intensively to understand how various new and longer-term resident groups accommodate each other through community institutions such as schools, churches, hospitals, and the like. Grants in the second category to educate the public about immigration issues have recently concentrated on dissemination of information about the new amnesty program. We're doing a lot of radio and TV and public service ads, and again, we're relying very heavily on our colleagues, our local grant-making colleagues, to tell us how to frame these messages and what channels to use to get the information out to people who need to hear them. Grants in the third category to clarify and monitor laws relating to refugees and immigrants go principally to national groups that can cite problems that are coming up with the implementation of the law, bring high-quality legal talent to bear on that, and then get the word out of the results of those efforts to service groups around the country. And we believe that probably the issues that they will be most involved with are questions of due process in the hearings, documentation that's necessary to qualify for amnesty, and job discrimination issues. Finally, in the area of economic self-sufficiency for newcomer groups, one of our programs has helped support 3 loan funds, which are expanding the base of entrepreneurs among refugee groups in the U.S. One of these loan funds is located in Miami and works with the Haitian community, another in San Francisco, and there's one here in Portland, which focuses on refugees from Southeast Asia. The Portland-based International Refugee Center of Oregon and the other groups are all being studied by a team of consultants we have engaged. We hope to learn whether any one of the investment strategies that the 3 are using makes more sense, generates more jobs, leads to more community influence than others, and we hope to learn which cities are most responsive to the needs of these new entrepreneurs and which locations do the established institutions such as banks provide the most supportive atmosphere. We believe that where banks and other civic leaders do more to help these loan programs work, more money will be likely to follow. We also hope to learn what scale of investment from an outside foundation helps lever support from local donors. I use these 2 topics, poverty and immigration, to illustrate 2 very different approaches to Ford Foundation and National Foundation programming, one where we create an organization to fill a gap, and another where we work very intensively with local donors and local activists. But I think in both cases certain common principles hold true, and I thought I'd just end with a few remarks about that. The first is that as a national foundation, we are most often working in several locations on the same problem. We rarely work in one location on a local problem. We see that as the domain of local donors, and they do a very good job of that. And so Ford often tries to occupy a middle ground between local services and local programs and the development of national policy. Second, we are drawn increasingly to situations where Ford can join with new sources of money and other donors, and hence our interest here in to what degree the banks have been engaged in the Refugee Loan Fund, or our interest in the community development example I gave you, the degree to which corporations come forward and put money into these low-income community housing programs. It is our experience that when corporations and other philanthropic donors, private foundations, community foundations, come together, set priorities, put money on the table, and invite a national foundation in, those national foundations very often come in. And I thought I'd just give you a couple of examples of that. We were recently approached by Boston, which said to us that it had a $5 million package of support it needed to put together for community development and low-income housing production, and that they had put on the table 2.3, 2.4, something like that, from local foundations, something like $1.8 million from the United Way, and they asked us to come in and finish out the $5 million. We ordinarily would not make grants in quite that fashion. But we were so impressed with the collaboration among the local donors, and particularly the fact that United Way, for one of the first instances that I know of in the country, was putting close to $2 million on the table for low-income housing development through community development corporations. We decided to make a $1.5 million grant, and I think that illustrates the power of these collaborations. Another good example is in Puerto Rico. About 2 years ago, Ford, Rockefeller, Carnegie, and MacArthur, 4 large national foundations, came together to put together $4 million in a package which was then offered to the corporations and the communities that operate in Puerto Rico if they would match it 2 to 1. And they are in the process now of matching that and have raised around $5 million from such companies as Digital, Intel, SmithKline and Beckman, Schering-Plough, Bacardi, Hoffman LaRoche, Squibb, Banco Popular, and Chase Manhattan. They will ultimately put together $8 million package and have R4 and have a nice nest egg of $12 million with which they are starting a new community foundation there. In a number of cities around the country, Miami, Baltimore, Philadelphia, Cleveland, we are approached with these kind of deals. And I think that is a telling point about what draws national foundations together. Finally, I'd say again that we rely very heavily on the knowledge that's developed by local foundations, principally small private foundations, and very often community foundations. Community foundations are increasingly partners for the Ford Foundation, and we're doing a lot more work in collaboration with them. It seems to me that whatever administration we have in Washington in the near future, we can be sure of a couple of things. We are not going to have large-scale resources to spend on social problems, so we had better be very sure that what we use carefully, and therefore we need to have accurate information on which to base our social policy choices. Foundations like Ford and other national foundations and local foundations, I believe, can help develop this kind of knowledge in a nonpartisan, highly professional manner. Second, we also need local organizations that can take the knowledge that's developed locally and nationally and bring people together to consider how it applies to their own local context. It seems to us that there are too few organizations with the credibility and the neutrality to convene various interest groups and begin the problem-solving process. And we have seen a number of instances when local and regional foundations have been ideally suited to this task and have taken it over and done a very good job. And for that reason, in fact, and because we hope to have more powerful local donors in different parts of the country as our partners of the Ford Foundation in the future, we've recently launched a new program to help expand both the capital base and the leadership capacity of small foundations around the country. And we'll be announcing another round of grants of that kind very soon. I also believe that national and local foundations have a terribly important role in developing fragile ideas and in protecting the very small voice of underrepresented groups and defending basic concepts such as fairness and reduction of discrimination when, because of a particular constellation of events, those ideas are at risk. And looking ahead, we see no shortage of worrisome issues and fragile ideas for us all to worry about together and to work on. If you think about issues such as the credibility of the government raised by the Iran-Gate problems, the issues of interracial tension, problems that we see particularly in the northeastern cities now, and if you think of the very remarkably positive but also sometimes unsettling transformations that have been brought about by such things as women's changing roles, changing family roles, or by the influxes of newcomers into this country, it seems to us there's plenty to do. There's lots for foundations to do. Foundations have a part in all this problem solving just like everybody else, and the question is really whether we will play our part responsibly and imaginatively. And I, for one, feel very blessed by the opportunity to be at the Ford Foundation and keep trying, and I look forward to doing more work with my colleagues here in the Portland area. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much for those excellent remarks. We're now ready for questions from the audience. If the staff would collect the written questions, they can bring those up to the head table, and Mary Kramer will ask the first question. Mary?
Thank you for a very informative speech, Susan. Several months back, we heard from Jerome Hines here at the City Club, and he was talking about funding for the arts in New Jersey. And someone asked him the question about funding, how decisions are made. There are so many arts organizations. How do we make that critical decision? His comment was that we decide who gets the funds on the basis of these are the groups who will survive. I heard you talking about new organizations, new ideas. Can you tell us a little bit about the philosophy involved, which I think contrasts to what Mr. Hines is talking about?
As we look at different fields that the Foundation works in, and the arts field is no different, I think, than any other, we ask ourselves, what are the important problems in the field, and what are other people doing, and where are the gaps, and where could a foundation like Ford have a particular role? We would not be in the business today of creating new arts organizations. I certainly agree that there are a lot of important arts organizations struggling hard to survive, and their financing is a very crucial problem that ought to be worked on. We look at the creation of new organizations when we think there's a field, such as the poverty field, that has plenty of important actors in it, but a particular gap that a national foundation like ours could fill. And it seems to me that each field has to be examined that way. You've got to ask yourself what you can contribute and what's different than somebody else can contribute. We were so concerned, in fact, with the foundation's history in arts funding. If we look back some 10 years ago at the prior 20 years of support of arts organizations, and the Ford Foundation had given away more than $100 million in endowment grants, some of which were not as happy a story as we heard earlier about Portland. And our $100 million for endowment grants had been matched by another 100 from other donors. So $200 million had gone into the endowments of some of these organizations. And the bottom line 20 years later was that they were almost all in worse shape than they were originally when we started. We believed then we were doing something terribly wrong. $200 million and everybody in worse shape is an awful story. And we became very concerned with the stabilization of arts funding and arts organizations, and in fact constructed a very different way of granting money to arts organizations that rewarded living within your budget, that over time set some standards, and if you met those standards, we'd help organizations build a cash reserve that was equal to a significant amount of their budget to give them some kind of freedom from the ups and downs of budgeting. So that concern of long-term support and stability of arts organizations would be at the top of our list, and that's just different field by field how you'd feel about it.
I'd really like to take the next question from the floor. Are there no questions from the floor? Yes, we have one.
Hi, I'm Charlene Kahn. I'm a City Club member. I don't know if this is on. Can you hear me? Okay. I'd like some comment from you on the issue of homelessness, which is certainly a very active one here in Portland and real cost to life nationwide. The fact that funds are probably going to die out from the traditional source, which is the government. Do you think your foundation might step in to fill that need or to help set up models to deal with it? What's your comment on that? Yeah. Thank you.
We have had a couple of consultants helping us think about how we could make an important contribution in that field. It certainly is at the top of most cities' agendas as you move around the country. We believe that probably the contribution we'll be likely to make is first in a heavy concentration on problems of low-income housing, of building more low-income housing, getting that process started again, getting inventive financing schemes going, and second on looking at and supporting interesting model programs that provide the transitional social services that now seem to be very important for populations that have, in New York City, for example, spent years in welfare hotels and all the kinds of problems that that brings of child care and family disruption and stress and strain. So it'll probably, our grants will probably be more on the loan, our programs will be more on the loan than on the grant side, because we'll be doing loans out of our $100 million loan pool for model experimental programs that will combine both housing production and transitional social services. My sense is that there are a lot of foundations anxious to work in this field, see it as a very key problem, and that they're really looking for a way to do that. And we've had several conversations with other national foundations who are interested in doing some of this work with us. So I would hope that in the next year you'd see an increasing investment from foundations.
I'm Marilyn Lakinger. I'm a City Club member and also director of OMSI. I have been working in some of the low-income areas, our institution, and most recently had a community kind of discussion and had a great deal of anger from our audience and from the participants because they started talking about what I call grant mentality, which is you start a model program, you set it up for a number of years, the money dries up, and all of a sudden the people who have become very excited and very involved in the program are left hanging. And you see that all the time with government programs, and you see it also with foundation-funded programs. I was wondering what your perspective on this grant mentality is, and especially as you deal with poverty programs.
I think it's a real problem, you're right, in government and in philanthropy. It is why we have come to believe that this subject we've called replication is a very, very important one. That I agree with you, too many times that happens. And there are many foundations around the country which have rules that say they will not make grants to the same organization for more than 2 or 3 years, and yet they say they're in the model building business, and so they get right into this terrible dilemma. We at the Ford Foundation, I'm sure we have our catalog of mistakes like anybody else does in any foundation, but we've tried very hard to be clear about if we're starting in a new field. We recently started, for instance, a couple of years ago with a whole new set of community development corporations around the country working in slum neighborhoods. And we said we were going to stick with them for 5 years, and we were going to work very hard with them during the 5 years to help make the transition, build the collegial relationships with other sources of funding that would help them transition. And we've been pretty successful in doing that. But it takes that intention at the very beginning, and it is a real problem. And of course, some of the models don't really succeed, and so you shouldn't probably be funding them forever. But those that do, I think you're right. One has to feel, you should feel very responsible about them and be very careful about not starting something you can't stick with. And that's why this replication subject is something that's, to us, very important now, and trying to figure out how to do a better job of it.
We'll take a written question next. What subject areas were taught during the education half of the day for youth involved in the summer public-private venture for youth employment, and is the State Department of Education involved?
It was a question about what the content of the morning education program was for the youth in this special summer program, and was the State Department of Education involved in it. I believe the answer to the second question is yes. And the content has been a basic skills curriculum, basic reading, math, and life planning skills. So it is the kind of normal school curriculum that you would hope kids would end up mastering.
Member Gilbert Lamb, does the Ford Foundation have the policy of spending most of its annual income or only exceeding the 5% that is required by the government?
We spend the 5% that is required by the government in most cases, and occasionally have gone above it and never have gone below it as far as I can remember. In fact, in the first 10 years I worked at the Ford Foundation, there was a period when we were spending double our income. That was probably not a prudent practice, thinking about the foundation in the long run, and so that was ended. But we've tried to be at or exceed slightly the federal requirement. A number of foundations don't do that.
I have another written question. In the 60s, there were charges that the Ford Foundation financed studies in third world countries became part of American intelligence gathering. Do you think that was the case then? What about now?
Well, you know, it's very interesting. I didn't then and I don't now work in the developing countries part of the foundation. Jim Gardner, who is here, did, but I think he probably has had the same experience I have. Half the country thinks you work for the CIA, half the country thinks you're, you know, a liberal, communist, pinko, whatever it is. I mean, whatever the Ford Foundation has done, wherever it's been, I have great doubt that it was ever part of the CIA, and it certainly isn't now. But it is, you know, one sees things through different lenses at different times, and I can't speak for a past that I wasn't responsible for, but I would doubt very much that there was any truth to that. It's hard, though, to convince people you're not part of the government when your name is Ford and there's another foundation called Rockefeller and there were presidents and vice presidents with those names, so that also gets a little confusing to people.
John O'Brien, City Club member. In expanding programs from demonstrations to national products, I'm concerned with a feasibility question. Frequently, the special corporations of the type that you establish attract very high quality management, and the quality of that management frequently is equivalent to the kind of management that one would find in private industry. However, on a national basis, the people attracted to arts organizations, scientific, social service, community agencies frequently are drawn into those industries because of their concern for the art or the service or the performance or the creative effort, not necessarily for management purposes. What does the Ford Foundation do to try to strengthen the management side to buttress these organizations so that they have the capacity to deal with these multi-million-dollar developments that are on the horizon?
Well, I guess I half agree and half disagree with your comment. You're certainly right that people are attracted to this work because they care about the content of the work, not because they're always the most experienced managers. But on the other hand, I am very impressed as I go around the country and look at local programs with the great struggles that small nonprofit organizations have to keep afloat, to manage their money, to pay their bills or hold off the creditors while they pay a few. And I think they are a lot more skilled as managers than most people give them credit for. But I also agree with you that one can use management strengthening in any case. And the kinds of things we've tried to do with it is, one, as we funded, for example, small community development corporations around the country, to insist that those organizations have enough money, and we're going to grant them some of the money to do that, to pay decent salaries. Very often with small, growing community organizations, there's a real problem there. And people feel reluctant to pay the kind of salary that will get them the kind of management help that they need. And there are a lot of people who will work for less than other people but are still very skilled managers. So we insisted on that. Second, we have often supported and run ourselves various kinds of training programs. Again, in the community development field, we ran ourselves and then have supported a separate institution that is really a training program for development organization managers, how they think about deals, how they manage and package deals, how they manage their own organizations. It's an unglamorous, but I agree with you, terribly important part of funding in the nonprofit field. And my sense is that in most fields you have to tailor the strategy to fit the kinds of organizations and the kinds of management problems they have, but that it shouldn't be off the list at all. It ought to be high on the list of the kinds of priorities that foundations are concerned about, because they depend on the health and the strength of all these organizations to do the work that they care about. And if the organizations are frail, it's not going to be done well.
I think the chair will exercise its prerogative of asking a question, one that I'm getting quite concerned about. There seems to be a lot of momentum gathering to start to tax nonprofit organizations. Locally here in Oregon, it has more to do with property taxes, but nationally, just in the last few weeks, we've seen hearings before the Congress where nonprofit hospitals have been attacked because they're not doing enough charitable work and don't deserve their tax exemption. The postal subsidy for nonprofit organizations has not yet been funded, and it may not be funded. There's been a proposal that Chairman of the Ways and Means, Rostenkowski, seems to be favorably inclined towards, of taxing foundation income starting out at 5%, but don't forget our original income tax rate was 13%, I think. Do you have any comments on what we might be able to do locally, and is the Ford Foundation attempting to do anything in connection with this sort of what looks like to me a movement?
Yeah. I think all the foundations are concerned about this, and many of the nonprofit groups are, and we have done a couple of things. One, we're part of a group of members of the Council on Foundations that meets regularly and is talking about a strategy to contend with these forces. Second, we have funded some studies recently that are just about to be completed of the business activities of nonprofit organizations, and to try and develop a clearer rationale and sort out what ought to be in and permitted and what perhaps ought not to be permitted. It seems to me that if you look at some of the nonprofit groups around the country and the ire that they generate among some of their for-profit business competitors, there are some legitimate issues there. It may not be quite as simple as everybody has assumed it has been over the past few years. So part of our strategy has been to try and develop some data, look at what the worst abuses are, try and inform ourselves better about that, and then frame some kind of legislative strategy that makes sense. There is a lot of sensitivity about this. I heard that the hearings in Washington in the last month were very, very anti-nonprofit organizations, and very strongly, a lot of strong speakers speaking about what they considered the abuses of the business activities of nonprofits. And so I suspect that's going to be an important topic, and we hope that the data that our grantees are now assembling will be helpful in understanding where that anger comes from and what's legitimate in it and what isn't. But it is going to be an important topic, and I don't think there's any easy answers, but we should all be very concerned about it, I think.
My name is Sharon Shannon. I was one of the designers of the ex-offender supported work project for Washington State. As you may know, we have a tremendous problem of prison overpopulation here in Oregon. Is Ford still interested in the topic of prison populations?
We have not had that as a high priority in a number of years. The Clark Foundation has been the principal foundation doing work in that area, and I think does a very creative and good job in it, but we have simply gotten out of it. We've been very discouraged by some of the results of the work we did, and that, unfortunately, I think in the whole criminal justice field, the sense among many of the funders is that this is a tough field and one in which there are not many successes, and so a lot of people have fallen away. I think were we to find something very interesting and very promising, we'd certainly look at it again. And we have often relied on Clark to be that kind of filter for us, because they're very active in the field, seem to have a very knowledgeable staff, and we no longer have the staff who are able to sort through the proposals we get. So it's generally that we're out of that field.
Thank you, Susan.
Sorry.
Thank you very much. Our time's about up. I do appreciate your being here again and taking some time off your vacation, and thank Ned Look through his good offices that found a way to get Susan to spend some time here in Portland, and we appreciate you being here and your remarks very much. Meeting's adjourned.